To me, the toughest people are the people who know how to be vulnerable. Vulnerability is not a bad thing. It's honesty and it's truth. And it's actually the people that are most impressive are the ones that can be vulnerable. But vulnerability in our society has gotten this bad name of, you put it, weakness. Like if you're silent, it means you're weak. Oh, sometimes the smartest people know how to be silent. They know when to shut up. They know when to close, not to speak. It's a tragedy in many ways because our society cultivates that type of, you got to be a go-getter. As a matter of fact, you mentioned men. Many women are trying to copy men and do the same thing. But that approach to life, a more intimate, more gentle approach, that crying and emotions are very much part of who we are, is far healthier and far more real. And it's time to tell all the alphas that part of being a real tough guy is also knowing how to be a person who can be sensitive. And it's just not a dog-eats-dog world of survival of the fittest. Feeling for another and feeling for yourself is very, very human. As a matter of fact, it's the strongest tool we have. Because let me ask you this. If everybody's going to go with an alpha approach, what is that going to do for relationships and love? Isn't love also an element of vulnerability, of surrendering? There's another person. It's not just about me. But it goes back also to this egocentric society we live in. I always tell people, if you see someone that's too arrogant, they're probably very insecure. So they just hide it, they mask it with their aggression and so on. But they're really just afraid. A little child that's afraid. So I think a lot of the alphas you see are not alphas at all. They're just scared children that are putting on like you have those animals that make themselves bigger than they are to frighten others, but they're not really that way. Or the porcupine, the sharpest needles of the porcupine to protect the underbelly, which is the most sensitive underbelly of all animals. So sometimes the outer aggression and the outer strength is just masking inner vulnerability. And it's time to change that attitude. And it's really about finding yourself. So there are times we need to be strong, but there are times that it's perfectly fine to surrender and know there's another person in your life and you're giving, and you're, I don't say submitting, but you're also deferring, you yield. You don't have to always win. You don't have to, But we live in a world, again, it's a very egocentric world where it's about me, survival of the fittest, whoever's more powerful. If I don't take care of myself, no one else will. And that really cultivates a approach of being far more selfish and narcissistic. Like the guy that goes on a date and he speaks about himself for 2 hours. And then he turns to the woman and says, okay, enough about me. Now, what do you think about me? So like 2 levels of narcissism. First he talks about himself. Now he thinks in his benevolence, he's allowing her to talk about himself, about him, not about her. So this is the society. It's driven very much about me. And I think it comes from a deep insecurity. Because again, going back to purpose, if you don't know who you are, you're going to start creating all kinds of fabricated strengths. And in turn, it creates this illusion that being vulnerable or crying is weakness. Not weakness at all. It's great strength. Imagine a kettle that's boiling and there's no spout. It'll explode or implode. Tears, an expression of emotion, is like the spout. You have a lot of emotions in you. It's good to express them. It's good to cry out. It's a sign of a healthy expression. If not, what do you think happens? It ties you up in knots. We know the body keeps the score, as they say. Traumas of our lives that are not expressed, ultimately, they don't go away. They just go inward. And then you become this very tight individual filled with these complex emotions and neurosis because you've never allowed yourself to speak. I've met people who told me they haven't cried since they're 5 years old because they were told only babies cry. What happened to all those emotions? They imploded. And the person is generally, usually quite dysfunctional, to be very frank. I remember a guy came to see me and he was telling me how he's been bullied in his life and he's always the victim and he's always being hurt. It was really tragic. It just made me cry just to look at him. So I asked him, I said to him, tell me, have you ever cried about your life? He says, I haven't cried since I'm 5 years old. My father told me, never cry. Only babies cry. And that, froze him. So I don't know. I didn't even know what I should say to him. I asked him to stand up. He was sitting in my office. And I stood up and I went over to him and I hugged him. He froze. I couldn't tell you. I felt like a a solid piece of concrete. And I saw how tight he was. Like his whole body just froze up. Like I guess nobody had hugged him ever. And I just said, he said to me, "Why are you hugging me?" I said, "I just wanted to show some compassion, some feeling for you." But he couldn't even deal with it. And then he said to me this line, he said, "If I start crying, I don't think I'll ever stop. I have so much in me." So it's exactly the kettle. So that's called alpha male? That's not exactly alpha. A person who's unfortunately, my goal with it was one thing: give him the permission, the license. You can cry. You have a license to say I'm in pain. You have a license to say that I was hurt. That's always the beginning of any healing. Break the silence. Allow yourself to breathe. Don't hold it in. It's like trying to hold in the breath. No, you have to exhale. And that's part of healing. It's like every infection that festers, you need to open it up to fresh air.
The idea of releasing pressure is, could not agree with it more. Like, and if you keep it within, if you suppress it, I feel like it comes out in weird or wonderful ways. Yeah. And if you keep it in knowingly, I think you do explode. You snap at people. You're angry. It comes out in horrible ways. And I used crying. I still cry like every so often. The grief will catch me, and I will cry. But I've learned not to hold it back, for sure. Like, and cathartic, great word for it. It really is cathartic to cry. Yeah. And allow that pressure to be released and come out.
Yeah, God forbid, somebody dies in a family, it should never happen. But the idea of sitting, in the Jewish tradition, there's Shiva. 7 days you sit, you don't go to work, people come visit you. It's very, very healing. Don't try to be so tough. I'm getting back to work. No, there's nothing wrong with taking off a week in honor of a father, a mother, or a relative that has passed away. Besides respecting them, just for your own emotions, allow yourself to, it's like a wound. A wound needs to heal. Don't force yourself, If you force yourself, the wound will not go away.
The body does keep score. It does. I was in a meeting, it was a baby loss meeting, and it was 2 or 3 weeks after Jacob had died, and I hadn't cried. I physically couldn't. I don't know what it was. I couldn't feel any emotion. I couldn't cry. And I went to this meeting, and people were sharing their emotions and stuff, and after that, it just released something in me. I was able to cry, and it all started to come out, and I started to feel better eventually. But there was a gentleman there who, he said, "I felt the same way as you." He said, I didn't cry for 2 years. I just couldn't do it. And one day, my father came to the door, and when I opened the door, he looked at me. He'd not spoken to me about the baby. He'd come to speak to me about the baby. And I fell to the floor, and he said, I cried for 2 weeks. Like, I couldn't stop crying. And it was that point of, it doesn't go away. Suppressing it does not make it go away at all.
No, of course not.
How
old was Jacob?
He was a baby. So he was a stillborn baby. So we was expecting, it was our firstborn son. We were expecting him, and then when he was delivered, he wasn't breathing. So it was it was very difficult. And I think I cried a little bit when it happened, and then I felt no emotion for 2 or 3 weeks, and I really wanted to. Like, I remember this frustration with not being able to feel anything. I felt really guilty about the fact that I couldn't grieve him. And I knew my process, because I'd lost my grandparent one time, and my grandmother, she'd passed away. And that process for me was very much seeing her, having those moments with her after she passed, her funeral. Like, I really grieved over her. So those 2 weeks where I couldn't feel anything with Jacob were like torture to me. So I knew that I had to cry. I knew that it had to come out at some point. And it did. It took a long, long time period to go through that and get to the other side. But again, it's difficult to talk about sort of the idea of there being a silver lining for that. I remember thinking how cruel it was that this had to happen for this good thing to happen as well. I still can't explain that to people, but I do think that it is the case with a lot of the people we meet. They've been through some kind of tragedy that's led to growth, and them being able to help other people as well. I don't know if you see that yourself.
Of course. There's an expression in the Talmud that says when you pray for someone else in need, your need will be responded to first. In science and psychology, in neuroscience, there's a concept of mirror neurons. mirror neurons, that we mirror each other's neurons. I mean, the classic example is that you see, for example, someone's about to close the door on their finger and they don't even realize it. You'll even cringe. You'll say like, ouch. Why? You're not feeling it, but you identify so much with the other. You're like mirroring their experience, which is really the power of empathy, that we're really, on some fundamental level, really one. Even though we feel like we're two people, but that's more on the external level, especially if you're familiar with quantum mechanics and science physics. It talks a lot about the intrinsic unity of all atoms, that everything in this world is like interconnected. It's like one large organism. It's only due to our own blindness that we don't realize that we're part of one reality. So the idea that one part of the body is strong and it strengthens other parts of the body is not so surprising. And that's why when we reach out to each other, someone in a situation, someone else can help you in more ways than one, not just because they're empathetic and they're sensitive, but because they're part of you. And when they allow that to come out, that love, that actually is a healing force. It's just like we see people who've been in injury. So then the part of healing is to strengthen other parts of your body, because as you get stronger, it'll also strengthen that part that has been injured. So the human race is that way. And it's a message that most of us are not even aware of. You know, we see ourselves as separate entities, and yes, it's noble to be benevolent and kind and compassionate, but it's much deeper than that. We're all parts of one larger organism. If one part hurts, every other part is hurting, whether you know it or not. And that's why it's so tragic when you see war or genocide or any form of injustice. It's like hurting. Imagine a human being going the right hand, killing the left hand, or hurting the left hand. Right? It's absurd. But that's the story. So in mystical teaching, it teaches that there's an intrinsic unity that connects us all. But then there's this cosmic concealment that doesn't allow us to see it. So we think we're separate entities, when in truth we're really one.
I think a lot of it as well comes down to that idea of ego again. Like because we have consciousness and we have these egos that, yeah, we don't feel connected. We feel very selfish, or that we need to look after ourselves. Ego's a topic that does really well on our channel, because I think a lot of people wrestle with the idea of ego, especially the idea of striving for success, entrepreneurship, trying to, find place in the world, especially like the business world. What's your take on, having ambition and balancing that with ego as well?
Let's start with this. Every human being needs to have a healthy sense of self. So ego is a very positive thing. It gets out of control, like anything in life, when it's the only force in your life. It's all about me. So the goal here is not annihilation of yourself or of your individuality or of your identity. It's knowing how to harness it and balance it. So I'll introduce you to a new word. It's a word in Hebrew. I'll just say the Hebrew and then I'll explain. But it's a tremendous word. I'll spell it B-I-T-T-U-L. It's called bittul. What it means is, it's hard to even translate, but I'll try to do my best. A combination of modesty, humility, but even more than that, suspending yourself in face of something greater than yourself. So how does that work together with ego? Having a self is a very important thing, as I said. Self-preservation, self-respect, self-esteem. Someone that feels like a doormat, that feels worthless, is not healthy. So you need to have value, but you have to recognize that all your strengths are not self-made. You're not a self-made person. You have parents, whether you believe in God or not, but you have life came from somewhere. God gave you life. Moses, the Bible tells us, was the humblest man on earth. But Moses was also the greatest man, chosen by God. He's like the greatest leader. So how do you balance those two? He was quite aware of his qualities, but he always said to himself, they're not my own. I was given to me as a gift. And if someone else received this gift, they may have done better than I. So you see a combination of ego and individuality, but also humility. The mistake that people think is ego and humility are antithetical. They're not. A healthy ego means I'm a sense of self, but not because I made myself. I was given value. I have a line in my book, Toward a Meaningful Life. Birth is God saying you matter. You matter not because you think you matter, not because you have a healthy ego, because you were put here with a purpose in this world. So it's recognizing that yourself, the identity that you are, is not just because you made it on your own and you were successful because of ambition and other reasons, but you were blessed. So you get credit, but it's not all about you. There's a great statement from one of the sages, Hillel. He said, if I'm not for myself, who will be for me? But if I'm only for myself, what am I? So on one hand, we need to understand the value of our own contributions, but we also understand that we're also part of something bigger, and that your very self, the self that you are, is not independent of that bigger reality. That's the balance. And I would go a step further, that a person whose ego and self is driven by something greater, the ego is a far stronger one, because sometimes you have to fight for yourself. Whereas a person who's just an egomaniac will sometimes retreat when they shouldn't be retreating because of their own fears or insecurities. So I would say the most secure thing in life is to know that you are not made, you were put here. And that gives you a certain divine purpose. The first thing the Bible says, the human being was created in the divine image. Nothing in this world is divine, but you were created, it means you're a piece of the divine. I don't know if there's a more powerful ego statement than that, but that makes you more responsible, not makes you more arrogant. So I think that's the balance that is missing very often in our society. Going back to the point of feeling that if I don't take care of myself, no one else will. When you see selfishness, it makes you also selfish. You have to match others because they're not going to protect you. So therefore you have to protect yourself. I always love this joke about these two guys that go camping, and in the middle of the night, one of them hears a bear rustling about. A bear is, looking for food. So he wakes up his friend and says, we got to get out of here, there's a bear. And as he's doing so, he's tying the shoelaces of his sneakers. And his friend says, what do you think, you can outrun the bear? He says, no, all I have to do is outrun you. This is the classic me. But we have to also know there's a deeper side to us, which is, as I mentioned before, the connection that we all have. So I don't see it as a contradiction. I'll just give an example. Look at the human body, a healthy human body. Look at nature. It's made of individual parts. The heart and the brain are very different. The lungs and the liver are very different. Every organ, every faculty, every cell in the human body is different, but they all work together in this unbelievable harmony. So it's not about everybody being a clone. Individuality actually contributes to the harmony. Think of a symphony. You have an orchestra of many different instruments, many different musicians. They're different, but they're all working together. So frankly, ego, and healthy individuality complements the synergy of the whole and vice versa. Everybody else complements each other. That's the challenge. What we often do is go to extremes. Either it's complete, fierce individuality at the expense of others, or I completely give up and I completely annihilate my own self for others. Both are not healthy. Your heart needs to be a heart for the brain to be a brain, and the brain needs to be a brain for the heart to be a heart, and then they work together. I don't know how many films in the world don't work out, but the ones that do work out and they get produced, look how many credits there are. I'm always amazed how so many people with egos got together and able to pull it off. Then you hear all the nightmares behind the scenes and how many films do fall apart because they can't. But at the end of the day, hundreds, thousands of credits, and I'm sure there were conflicts. And yet they figure it out. Maybe incentives, whatever. My point is, we have the ability to have healthy egos and also find the balance to not become arrogant.
The film industry is that's like a good way of putting it.
Even there, which is driven completely by ego.
Massively, yeah, that's why I think that, yeah.